Thank you, everybody, for coming to our first Migration, Mobilities, and Social Politics event, or MMSP event. If you are interested in coming to any other MMSP events in the future, please have a look at the Balsillie webpage under BSIA events, and you will see a listing of all the events that are happening over the next 4 to 6 weeks. And if you would like to receive email messages from myself, Suzan Ilcan, or Margaret Walton-Roberts, we're both the co-conveners of the MMSP cluster, please email us and we would be happy to put you on our list. I also want to mention that we will have a brief, short 10-minute meeting after this session is over for those people who are part of the MMSP cluster or who would like to be part of the cluster. So please hang around for a little bit. 1:30 we'll likely get together for that meeting. And I'd also like to tell you that today our presentation will be recorded, but none of the questions or comments from the audience will be recorded. So please feel very comfortable to pose your questions, make your comments. So thanks very much for that. Our speaker today is Dr. Luann Gingrich. She is an associate professor in the School of Social Work and director of the Global Labour Research Centre at York University in Toronto. Her talk will be recorded, as I mentioned, and just a few words about the kinds of research that she does. Her research investigates the interface of social welfare and human services, inequality and diversity, and migration studies. She applies her theoretical and empirical work to the development of approaches to research social policy and practice that analyze processes and outcomes of social exclusion. She has many published books, articles, and reports on these very ideas and themes. For example, she's the author of Out of Place, Social Exclusion and Mennonite Migrants in Canada, and is the co-editor of Transnational Social Policy, Social Welfare in a World on the Move. She's also published in several journals, such as the International Journal of Migration and Border Studies, International Migration, Social Policy and Administration, and the Refugee Survey Quarterly. Dr. Luann Gingrich has organized, led, and contributed to many community-based and policy-oriented initiatives. So please join me in welcoming Luann.
Thanks so much. What a great group. Thanks for coming today. And I do want to thank Suzanne for inviting me, and to Joanne, wherever she went, for so patiently and carefully attending to the details for today. I've been looking forward to our discussion. The interviewer asked, "After all, do you feel that your future here is better than your future in Syria?" Noor, "Yes, of course." And Hannah, "I swear to God, sometimes I can't believe I'm here in Canada." Afra joined in, "This is the only country where if you have a dream, you can achieve it. All the time and the effort you are putting toward your dream, at the end, you are going to achieve it." Now, this is what we like to hear from newcomers. These words from young former refugee women aged 19 to 21 who were resettled in this region, their words make us feel good about ourselves, our way of life, and our values. However, this is not all they have to say about life in Canadian schools, workplaces, social services, and communities. Their narratives are contradictory, revealing simultaneous gain and loss, and are punctuated with discouragement, frustration, hope, worry, and sometimes anger. They described an endless and seemingly directionless series of practices, including assessment and classification, followed by an intervention, and then evaluation or assessment, classification, and so on. The standards for comparison at every phase of the process are predetermined and assumed benchmarks for success, stepping stones toward goals and ideal that are defined for them by the settlement worker, teacher, sponsorship group member, institution, or policy. More importantly, I suggest that such laudatory words seduce us into beliefs and practices that undermine meaningful inclusion and integration. My objective for our discussion today is to draw attention to the ways in which policies, services, and measurement tools that are geared toward common notions of inclusion and integration for newcomers are predicated on precise goals for them and beliefs about us, ideals, and ideas that work, ironically, to reproduce and reinforce dynamics of social exclusion and soft domination that cannot be reversed with good intentions. And I'll briefly introduce two models or frameworks of social inclusion that I think help us shift our conventional ways of thinking and common practices, models that go beyond person change to interpersonal change, place change, and system change. Now, this work draws on about 20 years of theoretical and empirical research that aims to conceptualize and measure the processes and outcomes of social exclusion. But for today, you won't be here until tomorrow or next week. Today, I'm drawing on a recent community-based qualitative study with Mennonite Central Committee, or MCC, in Ontario, and their refugee sponsorship program. I'll focus on the opportunities and the challenges of cultivating social inclusion and integration for refugee newcomers through sponsoring relationships. And I'll say that it's the paper, what I'm talking about today is loosely based on a paper that was recently published in the journal Refuge in a 2019 special issue on private sponsorship of refugees in Canada. So, a disclaimer. I'm presenting ideas for us to think about together, and I don't have it all worked out yet. And in some ways, I think what I have to say on the topic of refugee integration and inclusion is obvious. On the other hand, I've been struggling with these ideas for many years, as I've been wondering how very precise social and cultural norms are assumed to be universal, to be both desired and meaningful for everyone. And what does successful integration and inclusion look like when conformity is resisted and some aspects of our way of life are rejected by individuals and groups such as Mennonite migrants and others from more traditional and collective cultures? So I appreciate the opportunity to think about these important issues with you today. I'll say a little bit about Canada's Private Sponsorship of Refugees program, or PSR, and then about my case example. The PSR program in Canada has been hailed by some as an exemplar for social inclusion and integration of refugee newcomers into the host society. In the spring of 2019, the first sponsorship agreement holders, including MCC, celebrated 40 years of sponsorship, having begun in 1979 in response to the Indo-Chinese refugee movement. News articles tell heartwarming stories of ordinary Canadians stepping up to join a sponsorship group to welcome and support refugee newcomers. This self-proclaimed pioneering refugee resettlement program is overseen by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC, through the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, or RSTP. The program gives, quote, ordinary people across the country, unquote, the opportunity to use their own personal resources, monetary and otherwise, to be directly involved in the resettlement of refugees from abroad. Canada's PSR program has garnered a lot of attention and mostly accolades, especially since the response to Syrian refugees in late 2015. Just last month, Immigration Minister Marco Mendicino was in Geneva to take part in the inaugural World Refugee Forum. There, he boasted that Canada is serving as a model for other countries with a successful program that resettles refugees through sponsorship by private citizens. Yet the PSR program has also attracted some criticism, and there are suggestions that refugee sponsoring relationships don't always lead to successful integration or inclusion. Some scholars have asked questions about sponsoring relationships, issues of power, and the identities and roles afforded refugee newcomers in the sponsoring relationship and beyond. Audrey Macklin, for example, notes that power imbalances are baked into the structure of the private sponsorship program. Similarly, Craig Damian Smith notes that, quote, common references to our refugees or our Syrians by sponsors are revealing of the fact that private sponsorship is characterized by relationships of structural dependency, unquote. Taking a broader view, through a feminist geopolitical examination of the slow violence of war and displacement, Jennifer Heinemann concludes that private refugee sponsorship is at once laudable as voluntary sustained engagement of civil society, and it is also fraught with banal bureaucracy of waiting for displaced persons that can create a racialized geography of preferences. My research and my own personal experience has raised my own questions about our refugee sponsorship program. Those of you who have been involved in refugee sponsorship know that the initial smiles and warm hugs, relief and optimism for the future that are often featured in the media, these don't last. Safety, protection, and basic human rights are not enough to make a life. So let's take a brief look at how the PSR program works. Yes, I think that's right. Sponsoring groups agree to provide the refugees with care, lodging, settlement assistance, and support for 12 months or until the refugee becomes, quote, self-sufficient. Sponsoring groups are directed to partner with settlement services to support the settlement and integration of refugees. Now, while settlement and integration, these terms are not defined in government documents, emphasis is given to independence and self-sufficiency. For example, the RSTP Handbook for Sponsoring Groups states, during the first year, newcomers learn a tremendous amount and generally move from a high degree of dependence to a high degree of independence. Through it all, your role is that of an enabler, supporting newcomers to equip themselves, make their own decisions, and find out as much as possible about their new environment. Above all, you are providing warm friendship and support. One could do an analysis just on that paragraph and some of the contradictions and tensions that exist there. The specific outcomes identified by the Canadian government, finding employment, learning English, learning life skills to function in Canada, these suggest that priority is placed on affecting individual level adaptation so that the refugee newcomer family reaches economic self-sufficiency. Scholars and practitioners, even the general public, are somewhat preoccupied with concern for successful integration of refugees and immigrants. A Google search, I was curious, for successful refugee integration, in quotation marks, produces over 12,400,000 results. I was impressed. Despite a lack of consensus on the definition of inclusion and integration, there's a common sense, a logic of practice that guides roles and responsibilities, positions and dispositions in sponsoring relationships. This logic of practice also provides standards or benchmarks, usually implicit, for success. It's this logic of practice that I'd like to explore with you today. A little bit about my case example of MCC sponsoring relationships. MCC has received media attention recently as they were the first of various faith-based groups to sign an MOU with the federal government in 1979. They've sustained a vibrant refugee sponsorship program for 40 years. Qualitative data were gathered in 2018 through 7 focus groups, including 49 participants from 21 churches in 6 geographical regions, 7 interviews with 17 former refugee newcomers who were sponsored by one of the sample groups, a key informant interview with Brian Dick, the National Migration and Resettlement Program Coordinator, as well as MCC documents and publications. None of the sponsorships were named cases, and this is important for this particular study. Rather, all refugee families were identified through the Visa Office Referred Program or the Blended Visa Office Referred Program. So this means that sponsors had no prior relationship with the refugee newcomers they sponsored. Because a primary objective of the research was to understand the nature and development of sponsorship roles and relationships over time, the sample was limited to those who had sponsored a family or individual prior to the 2015-2016 Syrian resettlement efforts, as well as to groups who have maintained contact with the family they sponsored. Now, contact information for sponsorship groups before 2007 was limited, so our sample captured sponsorships between 2007 and 2015. However, as the data review, several congregations had been sponsoring for decades, even since 1979. My community partners at MCC identified the objective of this study: to examine how the relationships and practices with MCC's refugee sponsorship program invigorate or frustrate dynamics of social inclusion. Now, we spent many hours talking together about the concept of social inclusion and successful integration and what this means in practical terms. It was useful for us to look at how these concepts are commonly applied in the social policy literature, in research, and in practice. Integration and inclusion are considered essential to the resettlement of refugee newcomers. In practice, these terms are often used interchangeably, notwithstanding discrete conceptual roots and distinct, vast literatures. Particularly in the context of settlement services for immigrants and refugees, inclusion may emphasize a subjective sense of belonging and trust over the material realities of settlement and integration. Integration is most often equated with participation in various social arenas, and interventions focus on increasing individual capacity for meaningful incorporation into mainstream communities and institutions. Person change measures. For example, the stated objective of settlement services in Canada is to, quote, help them, refugee newcomers, to become participating members of Canadian society as quickly as possible, unquote. This familiar evaluative gaze lands squarely and exclusively on the refugee newcomer, producing an invisible yet idealized subject. Offering more depth of meaning and complexity, a popular analogy for integration or inclusion of immigrants and refugees is a two-way street, recognizing the need for reciprocal change between newcomers and hosts, where both the receiving communities and the newcomers change and change each other. Emphasis is placed not only on rights, but also on responsibilities of both the newcomer and residents to create the opportunities for immigrants' full economic, social, cultural, and political participation. Now, aiming for an even more robust conception of integration that recognizes refugee newcomers as stakeholders in the process rather than only sites of intervention, Lamping, Bertolo, and Walrab posit that the primary goal of resettlement is not to provide services, but to build relationships and a welcoming community. Similarly, Michaela Hinier's holistic integration model strengthens the emphasis on change within the social context and on the interrelatedness of different social levels and dimensions, stressing place change over person change. Yet the ultimate objective or goal of encouraging change in social contexts remains helping newcomers to adapt, to fit into existing social systems, institutions, and cultural norms. Most importantly, participation in the labor market. In practice, whether defined as settlement, integration, or inclusion, the outcome is most often assessed through individual and static indicators of financial independence or an emotional sense of belonging and trust. Often, one or the other is deemed adequate. When put into practice in social policy, social services, or sponsoring relationships, and whether from the political left or the political right, I argue that the focus is on individual level change and evaluation to support the victim of circumstance and systems on the one hand, or to punish and coerce the irresponsible deviant on the other. Furthermore, individualized integration is assumed to be a universal good from all political and ideological perspectives, and persisting social exclusion is recognized to be a threat to the social fabric of society. Integration or inclusion through person change implies a center or a series of centers whereby voluntary engagement or mandatory insertion moves an individual from exclusion to inclusion. Similarly, the common notion of integration rests on the premise of an already integrated, bounded society which faces the risk of disintegration and unbinding due to immigration. These common sense conceptions of social inclusion and integration are not to be dismissed. Rather, I position common sense as the object of study, our focus of attention, because common sense social inclusion is framed by a particular worldview that is so pervasive and familiar that it's often taken for truth. In my research, I adopt a reflexive, relational, and systems lens to examine the tensions and the contradictions of sponsor-newcomer relationships and associated positions and dispositions, or habitus, that are produced, both at the institutional level as well as interpersonal. I interrogate concepts of refugee integration or inclusion to be produced by an assumed logic that is associated with material and symbolic capital or resources in a social field. These are Pierre Bourdieu's terms. Such an approach is in keeping with Bourdieu's epistemic reflexivity. Epistemic reflexivity, a fancy term, it requires us to see that which we take for granted, to recognize that we have a worldview. That's not the only way to view the world. Bourdieu's practice of reflexivity entails the systematic analysis of practice in everyday social relations, the objective archaeology of our unconscious and the arbitrary. Reflexive sociology is critical of established patterns of power and privilege as well as the politics that supports them. More simply, reflexive analysis shifts our gaze. Rather than the conventional focus on excluded individuals or groups, the other, who are the targets of policies and services to help them become included and integrated, we take as our object of study this largely uncontested center and the patterns of power and privilege that are produced, in this case, through the institutional and interpersonal relationships of private refugee sponsorship. Now, a primary objective is to historicize and so denaturalize that which seems most natural in the social order, to the point of seeming inevitable. In other words, the focus of attention is on the ways in which we think about and engage with one another, as well as the implications of our work together. Now, this point of view requires courage and a willingness to be changed, and I commend MCC staff for engaging in this work with intentionality and curiosity. In our analysis of the ideas and ideals that are put to work in refugee sponsoring relationships, we examined roles, positions, and dispositions as expressed in the data. Now, other scholars have recently examined identities and roles afforded refugee newcomers in the sponsoring relationship and beyond. For example, Chris Kyriakidis and colleagues draw on Said's theory of Orientalism to argue that the refugee as non-Western other is constructed as uncivilized, unruly, and lacking in cultural sophistication, thus rendering our Western morality and civilization. Alternatively, humanitarian views of the refugee subject emphasize the suffering and hardship experienced by undifferentiated masses of refugees and asylum seekers, framing the character of the refugee in a positive light, but without agency. The refugee as deviant, ascribed low power and low value, is easily turned to threat. In contrast, the refugee as passive victim is deemed a worthy recipient of aid and support. In the context of sponsoring relationships, the ascribed identities afforded the refugee newcomer have everything to do with the disposition, posture, and imagined identity taken up by the sponsor. A focus on the other as the object of study and site of intervention constructs certain configurations of them, but more importantly, assembles an idealized us. The natural disposition of the sponsor in relation to the refugee newcomer in need of a humanitarian response is one of helper or protector, which reinforces a good deal of social distance and a hierarchical order of things. The helper habitus is inclined toward a person change approach to refugee newcomer integration. These positions and dispositions, commanding helper and passive victim, they seem natural, especially in the early days of resettlement, as related in accounts from both sponsors and former refugee newcomers. The sponsorship relationship was reported by all participants to be primarily utilitarian for the first 6 to 8 months, assisting newcomers with the basics of everyday life as outlined by IRCC, such as financial, health, housing, education, shopping, and transportation. We identified sponsor roles as settlement supporters, service connectors, social brokers, listening companions, and cultural mediators and advocates. Sponsoring relationships evolve, though, often moving from more immediate and practical concerns to emotional and social supports. Now, imposing the helper disposition into more personal aspects of life, some sponsors aspire to direct the decisions of newcomers, to, quote, make them good Canadian citizens. Ideas of citizenship were associated with learning English, finding employment, and becoming, quote, contributing members of Canadian society. We also learned that most of these relationships lasted well beyond the 1-year period of sponsorship. For some, sponsor and newcomer families celebrate together birthdays, births, weddings, holidays, and friendship. If successful integration or social inclusion can be indicated by ongoing relationships of seeming mutuality, so building social connections or bridging capital for refugee newcomers, these sponsoring relationships appear to be exemplary. I'll say a bit about what we learned from former refugee newcomers. Newcomers expressed their appreciation for the hands-on practical support they received from sponsors. People who arrive with the help of the Mennonite Church or churches with programs like that arrive with a huge blessing. It's a big help. Other newcomers recalled being pleasantly surprised by how they were received. Fatima, I did not expect such treatment. I had never seen that kind of kindness and hospitality before. But the everyday lives of refugee newcomers continue into month 13 and beyond, long after the contrived relationships of sponsorship end. The settlement experiences of former refugee newcomers sometimes expose stubborn dynamics of social exclusion, mingled with genuine expressions of social inclusion. One couple clearly expressed their deep frustration that they cannot live the type of life they led before they fled their home country, that their social and cultural capital does not function for them here, and they're not recognized as qualified, educated, and capable people in Canada, even years later. Nicholas, we had good occupational backgrounds in our home countries. Here it is useless. Our daughter is a petroleum engineer, and she is working as a secretary well, not even as a secretary. Indeed, Nicholas has been employed in a variety of jobs. He's been a dishwasher, a Walmart employee, a home maintenance worker, none of which afford the economic stability and social status to which he was accustomed, or with which most Canadians would be satisfied. Others expressed deep frustration with Canada's routines and regulations that prevent them from supporting their families and making meaningful contributions to their communities. One former refugee newcomer commented, "Canada has a huge contradiction in terms of its policies towards immigrants. What they say is different than their actions. Society expects you to come into society and do the jobs that children used to do. It's not easy to go up the ladder." Nicholas expressed his frustration at the barriers to opportunities in Canada, saying, "I still feel that the system is not ready for us." And returning to my conversations with younger refugee newcomers, all expressed a desire to contribute to their family's income rather than remaining financially dependent on their families, even those who were still high school age. All agreed that welfare is no solution because the money is just not enough, and they feel themselves to be a burden. School attendance among the young men especially is sporadic because the problem is the lack of money. Young men have to find jobs so they can support themselves and not depend on their families. But the work that's available to them keeps them stuck in place. Mohammed. For us, we are given unwanted work where we do not need to have conversations in English. All of this is called experience. You need experience to work, and you need work to get experience. This learning, you need at least a year to be like them. Language, education, social assistance, and employment, these discrete programs and social services converge for these newcomers, who in each case continue to make great efforts to meet the predetermined terms of success, even while compliance may undercut their own goals, aspirations, and needs. The systematic devaluation of education, knowledge, and expertise for newcomers in Canada's labour market and local communities is well documented, even when they are no longer newcomers. Study after study show that in comparison with white Canadian-born workers, even when we account for education and training, language skills, and work experience, people who are racialized or not white, Indigenous, immigrants, and refugees earn less, particularly upon entering the labor market, are almost twice as likely to experience low income, suffer negative impacts of recession first and longer, and are not likely to catch up to their Canadian-born comparators in their working life. Subjective exclusion, or subject formation and evaluation, functions over time as the dispossession of symbolic capital works to keep people in disadvantaged positions. The values and assumptions or worldview that direct how we organize ourselves make these dynamics of social exclusion seem inevitable and justified, even natural. Even the sustained relationships of some sponsorships could not shield the ways in which communities and institutions function to keep people marginalized, especially after the year of sponsorship. So, I'm left wondering, what are we missing? What's needed beyond good intentions, social connections, or so-called bonding and bridging capital, for the relationships of refugee sponsorship to be not only satisfying and meaningful for sponsors, but also effective for those who are sponsored? A reflexive view, so turning the gaze back on common sense, ideas and ideals that we take for granted, makes some truths visible. Many scholars agree that social services, healthcare, and education systems in Canada are firmly grounded in market logic. In our employment-based social welfare system, the cornerstone of all laws, policies, and human services is employment, or earning a wage. This is a moral imperative. In other words, those who do not earn a wage or do not engage in the labor market for a living are deemed lacking or morally inferior. These are ideas and ideals that we take for granted, I think, even assume to be true and inevitable. But this is a worldview that is not the only way to view the world. From refugee newcomers to immigrant women to Mennonite migrants to Central American sex workers in southern Mexico, my research over 2 decades reveals that displacement and migration is first and last about making a living, livelihoods. Migration from the global south to the global north, whether classified as forced or voluntary, is most accurately conceived as survival migration. Work as livelihood must be the core of successful integration. But research shows over and over that earning a wage in Canada's increasingly segmented labor market is something quite different than making a living. And paid work often both supports and undermines livelihoods. This means that Canada's employment-based social welfare system is grounded on myth, on an ideal that rarely exists and is seldom attained, especially for many women, immigrants, Indigenous, and racialized people, thus producing and reinforcing the selective processes and outcomes of social exclusion. An epistemic reflexive point of view brings into focus the realities of enforced dependency or the hostage-taking of market logic. Similarly, Bourdieu describes enforced conversions, often very costly and painful, which the newcomer has by force of necessity to undergo, as the universe into which newcomers must enter is also just as much as the one they are leaving behind, a universe of belief. Scholars have been looking for terms to describe the paradoxical positions of individuals and groups included, but made marginal in the divided social spaces and places of the global economy. For example, Amartya Sen refers to unfavorable inclusion, others to differential inclusion, subordinate and disadvantaged insertion, pseudo-inclusion, inclusive exclusion, and regulated inclusion. I find each of these terms useful. However, this is, I argue, the very essence of social exclusion, to be drawn inside to devalued and dispossessed places. Integration of the other into the valued center is impossible, as it is the exclusion of all that contradicts dominant norms and values that forms its very essence. Social inclusion or integration as person change constitutes enforced dependency on the market and marketized institutions. This is social exclusion by design, as we know that social inclusion is not available for everyone through paid work. Bourdieu describes this as soft domination, which occurs through offering or enforcing a space of possibilities, a structured ensemble of offers and appeals, bids and solicitations, and prohibitions as well, a system of regulated satisfactions while barring full access and limiting acquisition. This is the nature of the assumed center that remains uncontested in the common sense person change model of integration and inclusion. Social exclusion and soft domination rely on the belief that privilege is acquired, deserved, and earned through education and social networking, investing time, hard work, and money, even though we know that our institutions and markets function to precisely yet arbitrarily ascribe value, so that this same education and social networking, time, hard work, and money, they don't work the same for everyone. Soft domination can be harder to see than other forms of domination and abuses of power because it requires a self-critical consciousness to recognize the illusion, the lies, in which we believe. To conclude, the soft domination of the common person change model of inclusion makes it clear that social inclusion or integration is not simply the opposite of social exclusion. To put it simply, strategies aimed to help a person to fit into a system that is designed to exclude them only results in reinforcing and justifying social exclusion. Moreover, we know that highlighting and prioritizing the needs of refugees over and above other groups in our communities can increase tensions, competition, and resentment. Person change, inclusion, or integration serves to reinforce both the processes and the outcomes of social exclusion. There are two alternative models or frameworks for reimagining a meaningful and practical conception of refugee integration and inclusion that I've been thinking about and want to review briefly with you today. First, social inclusion as conflict transformation and social healing. A reflexive relational and system analysis situates refugee sponsorship within the broader context of forced migration, in conflict that is at once interpersonal and systemic, manifesting itself in fractured relationships between individuals and groups, communities, societies, and nations. Such an analysis confronts us with the inextricable ties between refugee-producing and refugee-saving nation-states, and the incessant historical practices that give rise to collective violence and thus generate whole populations that have experienced a deep fracture in human relationships as a result of fundamental violations of their human rights. Seeing integration or inclusion as conflict transformation focused on interpersonal and system change to address violence is uncommon in refugee-receiving countries in the global north. The social and the legal environments of host nations are relatively just and fair compared to refugee source countries, and by virtue of offering safety and protection, a national moral superiority is implied. Especially in the relationships of refugee sponsorship, inclusion as conflict transformation is a demanding point of view, as a critical gaze must be turned to self and other in social and historical relations of power and structural violence. From this point of view, diversity, variation, mobility, and conflict are seen as aspects of all urban social life and not exclusively an attribute of the other. Second, integration of place. Shifting the vantage point of refugee integration from the global north to the global south, Caroline Cajato and Lauren Landau consider inclusion of or by place, and assert that refugee interventions work when they are premised on aligned interest and solidarity between host and refugee populations. They suggest that social services and humanitarian organizations may be more effective by investing resources to help whole communities where refugees live, to benefit everyone. From this point of view, social inclusion cannot be achieved through change to or for the other to help those who are excluded, but practices must involve change with one another toward transformation at all levels: personal change, interpersonal change, and system change. To invest our energies in place, to work together to attend to the needs of the land and the people where we live, requires paradigm shifting. To eschew common sense binaries, and indeed to hold paradox. To take seriously the individual and the collective. To recognize the other as having something to give, and to see need in all of us. To value work differently according to shared needs in our communities. To know that common ideas and ideals of integration and inclusion are based on a lie, reinforcing processes of social exclusion that generate privilege that is not earned, not deserved, but is simply granted. And to use, rather than disavow, unearned power and privilege while challenging the injustice of it. To value who we are and the work we do, while also recognizing the need for change in our institutions, our communities, and ourselves. Social inclusion requires us to reverse our gaze, to examine, with curiosity and without judgment, our practices and beliefs that prop up our undeserved places and identities of privilege, to look at what we've done, to make room for learning and creativity. Thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.